Hello, welcome to week 5. This week we will review two important observational studies that investigate associations between exposures and outcomes: cohort studies and case control studies. In a cohort study, one or more groups, also called cohorts, are followed over time and are subsequently evaluated with respect to a disease or an outcome. Cohort studies are longitudinal and look forward over time, and therefore they can help to assess if an exposure or a risk factor preceded the disease or outcome of interest. They assess the incidence of outcomes over time between exposed and non-exposed groups. A cohort is a group. Cohort was a term used to describe military units in ancient Rome. In epidemiology, the term cohort is used to define a group of individuals who are followed over a period of time and see what happened to them. This is the classic study design of a cohort study. Typically, they start with people free from the disease that will be evaluated. One basic requirement of a cohort study is that none of the subjects should have had the outcome of interest at the beginning of the follow-up period. Exposure status is assessed at baseline to create comparable groups of exposed and non-exposed, and then disease status, or whatever the outcome of interest is assessed over time. The direction of the analysis goes from exposure to outcome. Let's take a look at the main steps to conduct a cohort study. We start with defining the study question, selecting the study population and the comparison group, measuring exposure and outcomes, looking at the follow-up of participants, and finally analyzing and interpreting the data. We do cohort studies when there is good evidence of exposure and disease, when the exposure is rare but the incidence of disease is higher among the exposed, when it's easy to have a follow-up, the cohort is stable, and when we have lots of funds to do the research. Study populations in cohort studies can be from the general population, or they can be members of specific groups based on certain characteristics or exposures to a particular factor. For example, they might come from the same geographic region or have the same occupation, or they might have different exposures to risk factors or being exposed to a common event. For example, after September 11, some authors conducted a descriptive cohort study with workers from the World Trade Center and assessed how many of them developed asthma in the years after. Within the cohort, the authors also classified individuals according to the use or the no use of protective measures for the dust cloud and assessed the association between the use of these protectors and the development of asthma. Cohort studies usually have a comparison group. When there is only one cohort, the study is a descriptive cohort study, and the comparison groups are sort of an internal comparison. In analytical cohort studies, comparison groups are external and should be as similar as possible in all regards except for the exposure and their study. This is the non-exposed group. In some instances, the outcomes of a study cohort can be compared with those in the general population. Classification of exposure status is made by looking at different sources of information. They can be existing records, interviews, or direct measurements in participants. With this data, study participants are classified in exposed or non-exposed. Outcomes in cohort studies might be discrete single events such as death or the first occurrence of hospitalization, or they can be multiple occurrences, such as the total number of emergency visits. They can also be measured as continuous variables, for example, blood pressure or levels of other biomarkers. Outcome assessment in a cohort study involves following all participants from exposure into the future. Different sources of outcome data can be used, such as questionnaires or examinations or looking at medical records. The follow-up is the main potential weakness of a cohort study because if a large proportion of subjects is lost, and particularly if losses are different between the two groups, the results might be biased. Cohort studies allow the calculation of the incidence of disease in the exposed and the non-exposed groups. So you can calculate incidence proportions, incidence rates, and therefore risk ratios or rate ratios and risk differences. You can also conduct multivariate analysis for these estimates for adjustment of the effect of potential covariates. Typically, we use 2 by 2 tables to summarize the data. In essence, the table displays the combinations of exposure and outcome status. 2 by 2 tables can be oriented in several ways, and this might cause some confusion when calculating measures of association. There are no standards on how to set up these tables, but if you are not careful, different orientations might result in errors when you calculate the measures of association. One way to avoid confusion is to always set up the 2 by 2 tables in the same way. For example, putting the exposure in the rows and the outcome data in the columns. Let's take a look at this 2 by 2 data from a cohort study assessing whether smoking increased the risk of developing cancer, lung cancer. 70 people in the exposed cohort of 1,000 developed lung cancer compared to 3 in a cohort of 3,000 who did not smoke. The risk ratio of 10 indicated that lung cancer is 10 times more common among smokers than non-smokers. Cohort studies can be classified as prospective or retrospective based on when outcomes occurred in relation to the enrollment of the cohort. So, for example, prospective studies will have data collected near the time of the event, and retrospective studies will have data from the past, kind of historical data. And bidirectional cohort studies are a combination of prospective and retrospective data, and in this case, the researchers analyze the previous history of the cohorts and then continue the research in a prospective manner. Prospective studies look forward, look to the future, examine future events, and follow a condition into the future. The investigators obtain accurate information about exposures before the disease developed in any of the subjects. After baseline information is collected, participants in prospective cohort studies are followed over time to assess if and when they develop the disease or outcome of interest. Retrospective studies look back in time to look at events that have already occurred. In retrospective cohort studies, the sequence of baseline exposure determination and longitudinal follow-up for outcomes is similar, but the difference lies in the time in which the study begins. In retrospective studies, the researcher assembles the cohort by looking back in time and placing data in the appropriate order and sequence. These studies use very frequently information from large medical databases to assemble the cohorts. The main advantage of retrospective cohorts is that they are much faster to perform. By using historical exposure data, we can reduce or eliminate the delays between exposure and outcome, and this is particularly useful for diseases with a long period between exposure and outcome. So, induction time is an important consideration when we design a cohort study. Induction time is the time between the exposure and the occurrence of the outcome. Um, and it's important that we estimate the latency time or induction time when designing cohort studies, because the period of follow-up necessary might be many, many years. So, for example, the mean induction time for asbestos exposure and the development of mesothelioma is 25 years. So it will be really hard to do a prospective cohort study to assess the relationship between asbestos exposure and mesothelioma. So, for diseases and exposures that have a long induction period, uh, a retrospective cohort design might be more practical. We have here two examples of prospective or retrospective cohort studies. In the first one, let's say we want to understand the determinants of coronary heart disease in women. So we start with two cohorts, one of obese versus lean women, and then we follow over time and compare the incidence of heart attacks in the two groups. In the second case, we have a retrospective cohort study that would like to assess whether chemicals used in tire manufacturing increase the risk of death. In this case, the investigator would have to go back to persistent data and records that perhaps were not necessarily acquired in a precise way because it was not for research purposes. And then they have to classify individuals based on their exposure status and then follow up and try to find in the records and compare the incidence of death. So, how do we decide when to use a retrospective or a prospective design? Prospective studies are more expensive and time consuming. They're not very good with diseases with long latency periods, but they provide better information about exposure and confoundings and are less vulnerable to bias. Retrospective studies are cheaper, faster, very efficient with diseases with long latency periods, but exposure and confounding data might be inadequate. In general, cohort studies allow calculation of incidence and they are very good to assess rare exposures and multiple outcomes from a single exposure. They can minimize selection and information bias, and the methods and calculations are easy to understand. Um, they have been used to identify, for example, unusual exposures such as exposure to the agent orange or the adverse effects of drugs such as the thalidomide, or unusual occupational exposures such as asbestos. Cohort studies might be inefficient for rare diseases or diseases that have a long latency. And sometimes the dropouts, especially in perspective, are very frequent, and minimizing them is really hard. These studies often require large samples and long time to complete. When they are retrospective, the information might be of less quality and more vulnerable to bias. Sometimes the information has not been collected for research purposes, such as administrative databases. When they are prospective, they might be expensive and time consuming for diseases with long induction and latency periods. There are many ways to assess the quality of cohort studies, and the Newcastle Ottawa scale is one of the most popular tools and is frequently used in systematic reviews of observational data. Basically, this tool assesses different domains about the selection, comparability, and outcome assessment of cohorts. Finally, the strobe statements are standards adopted by many journals to assess the quality of reporting of cohort studies.